A sheriff receives an emergency call from a young boy, but he didn't expect that there was a real tragedy behind the call. When he gets there, he discovers the real horror. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching us from. The house stood at the edge of a forgotten neighborhood, where even the street lights seemed to flicker with hesitation. Paint peeled from the walls, and the windows were smudged with grime, framing a home that had long been abandoned by hope. Inside, the air was heavy with neglect, damp walls exhaling the stale odor of decay. For 7-year-old twins, Michael and Malcolm, this crumbling house was not just a prison, it was a battleground where they fought to survive each day. Michael sat cross-legged on the floor, his eyes scanning the dimly lit kitchen. He was lean, his ribs visible through the thin fabric of his torn shirt, but his gaze carried a fierce determination that belied his frail body. Next to him, Malcolm shivered under an old blanket, his hands clutching the edges tightly. Malcolm's softer features were drawn with exhaustion, his eyes carrying a sadness far beyond his years. "Michael, I'm so hungry," Malcolm whispered, his voice trembling as much from fear as from the pangs in his stomach. Michael placed a reassuring hand on his brother's shoulder. "I know, Mal. I'll find something. Just hold on, okay?" But Michael knew the truth. There was no food to be found. The fridge had been empty for weeks, save for a half-empty bottle of ketchup and a few shriveled carrots that had long since grown mold. The cupboards were barren. Their stomachs had grown used to the gnawing emptiness, but it never stopped hurting. The cause of their misery was upstairs, snoring loudly. Roy, their white stepfather, ruled the house with an iron fist and a voice that thundered like a storm. His hatred for the boys was a constant presence, a venom he spat freely. He made no secret of his disdain, often calling them useless and burdens, while reminding them that they were lucky he hadn't kicked them out onto the streets. His racist slurs stung worse than the backhanded blows he dealt when they dared to defy him. Michael hated Roy with every fiber of his being. He hated the way Roy would drink himself into a stupor and stumble around the house, knocking over furniture and spewing insults. He hated the way Roy's eyes would narrow whenever he looked at Malcolm, a twisted smirk playing on his lips as if daring the younger boy to speak. But most of all, Michael hated how powerless he felt to protect his brother. Malcolm shifted uncomfortably under the blanket. "Do you think Mom's ever coming back?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Michael's heart sank. Their mother, Sharon, had been their lifeline. She was kind and warm, always tucking them in at night and whispering promises of better days. But she had vanished months ago, leaving no explanation. Roy claimed she had abandoned them, but Michael didn't believe him. Deep down, he feared something much worse had happened. "I don't know, Mal," Michael admitted after a long pause, "but we can't count on her coming back. We have to look out for each other now." The sound of heavy footsteps echoed from the ceiling above them, and both boys froze. Roy was awake. Michael quickly motioned for Malcolm to stay quiet, pulling him further into the shadows of the kitchen. The steps grew louder, descending the creaking staircase like an ominous drumbeat. Michael's heart pounded in his chest. Roy appeared in the doorway, his large frame silhouetted against the dim light. His face was ruddy from last night's binge, and his eyes glared at them with contempt. "What are you two doing in here?" he barked, his voice rough and slurred. "Nothing," Michael said quickly, stepping in front of Malcolm protectively. "We were just—" "Lying again, huh?" Roy interrupted, his lips curling into a sneer. "Figures. You little rats don't know how to do anything else." Michael clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. He wanted to shout back, to tell Roy he was the liar, the drunk, the reason their lives were miserable. But he knew better. Talking back only made things worse. Roy stumbled over to the fridge, yanking the door open and pulling out the bottle of ketchup. He chugged it like it was a fine wine, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand before tossing the empty bottle onto the floor. "Clean that up," he growled, turning to leave. But before he disappeared back up the stairs, he added, "And don't even think about eating anything. Not that there's anything worth stealing anyway." The door slammed upstairs and the house fell silent once more. Michael knelt down and picked up the bottle, his hands trembling with suppressed rage. Malcolm watched him with wide, fearful eyes. "I can't take this anymore," Michael muttered under his breath. "We can't keep living like this." "What can we do?" Malcolm asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "He'll hurt us if we try to leave." Michael didn't answer right away. He stared at the broken phone lying on the counter, its screen cracked but still showing a faint flicker of life. The device had been discarded by Roy weeks ago, deemed useless after he'd dropped it during one of his drunken rages, but Michael had kept it, hoping it might come in handy one day. He picked it up now, his fingers trembling as he pressed the power button. To his surprise, the screen lit up. There was no SIM card, but the emergency call function still worked. Michael glanced at Malcolm, who was watching him with a mixture of hope and fear. "I'm going to call for help," Michael said firmly. "Someone has to listen." "But what if they don't believe us?" Malcolm asked, his voice shaking. Michael met his brother's gaze, his own eyes blazing with determination. "Then we'll make them believe. I'm not letting him hurt us anymore." He dialed 911 and held the phone to his ear. His heart pounded as the line connected, and a calm voice answered on the other end. 911, what's your emergency?" Michael swallowed hard. "Please," he whispered, "help us. He's going to kill us." The line crackled, and Michael's heart sank as the screen went dark. The battery had died. He stared at the phone in disbelief, tears welling up in his eyes. Malcolm reached out and squeezed his hand. "Do you think they heard you?" he asked. "I don't know," Michael admitted, his voice barely above a whisper, "but I hope so." As the brothers sat together in the darkness, clinging to each other for comfort, neither of them noticed the faint red and blue lights beginning to flash in the distance. Help was coming, but they didn't know how much their lives were about to change. Sheriff John Carter leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight as he rubbed his temples. The station was quiet tonight, the kind of stillness that usually lulled the small southern town into a false sense of security. His desk was cluttered with files and reports, but his focus was far from paperwork. His thoughts wandered to his family, his 2 kids asleep at home, his wife likely catching up on a late-night book. He cherished the rare moments of peace, even if they were fleeting. Then the call came. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's voice crackled over the radio in his office. John sat up straighter, his attention sharpening. The dispatcher's tone shifted quickly from professional to concerned. "It's faint. Sounds like a kid. Says someone's going to kill them." John's heart sank. His hand instinctively reached for his badge as he leaned closer to the radio. "Do we have a location?" "Only a rough trace," the dispatcher replied. "It's coming from the east side of town, near Mason Road. Could be one of the abandoned houses there." Mason Road. John knew the area well. Run-down homes, forgotten by time and city planners, were scattered across that part of town. It was a place where hope had long been extinguished, a breeding ground for neglect and despair. "I'm heading there now," John said, grabbing his hat and heading out the door. "Send backup, but I won't wait." The night air was cool as John climbed into his cruiser. The rhythmic chirp of crickets filled the silence, but his mind was too focused to notice. As he sped down the empty streets, his thoughts raced. A child's voice on the other end of a desperate call wasn't something he could ignore. Memories of his own childhood clawed their way to the surface, moments of fear and helplessness he had buried long ago. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "Not tonight," he told himself, "not on my watch." The drive to Mason Road felt both too long and too short. The houses here were ghosts of their former selves, their skeletons exposed to the elements. Graffiti covered the walls, and broken windows glinted like jagged teeth in the moonlight. He slowed as he approached the address the dispatcher had provided, a sagging, two-story house barely holding itself together. John killed the engine and stepped out of the car. The air here felt heavier, saturated with silence. He clicked on his flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness as he approached the house. The front door was slightly ajar, creaking softly as the night breeze pushed against it. He knocked firmly, his voice steady and authoritative. "Sheriff Carter, is anyone home?" No answer. Only the faint sound of shuffling footsteps inside. His hand moved instinctively to his holster, but he kept his tone calm as he called out again. "I'm here to help. If you need assistance, please come out." Still nothing. John pushed the door open with deliberate care. The hinges groaned in protest, and the stench of mildew and rot hit him immediately. His flashlight revealed a scene of utter neglect. Overturned furniture, piles of garbage, and walls streaked with grime. He stepped inside, his boots crunching on shards of broken glass. The sound of a faint whimper caught his attention. He froze, his heart quickening as he turned toward the kitchen. The beam of his flashlight landed on a small figure huddled under a rickety table. A boy, no older than 7, clutching his knees to his chest. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "It's okay," John said softly, crouching to the boy's level. "My name is John. I'm the sheriff. I'm here to help you." The boy didn't move. His trembling hands tightened their grip around his legs, and his gaze darted toward the doorway behind John. Another sound, barely a breath, came from the shadows of the room. John turned his flashlight toward it, revealing another boy, also around 7, hiding behind a broken chair. This one looked even more fragile, his tear-streaked face partially obscured by an oversized blanket. "Are you two alone?" John asked, his voice steady but urgent. The first boy, who seemed slightly braver, nodded cautiously. "He's upstairs," he whispered. "Please, don't let him hurt us." John's jaw tightened. Whoever he was, the boys were clearly terrified of him. "Stay here," he instructed, his voice firm but gentle. "I'll be right back." He moved toward the staircase, the old wood groaning under his weight. Each step felt like a countdown. At the top of the stairs, he paused, listening for any sign of movement. A muffled snore broke the silence. John followed the sound to a bedroom at the end of the hall. The door was ajar, revealing a disheveled man sprawled across a mattress, an empty bottle clutched in one hand. Roy. John recognized him immediately. Roy had a record: petty theft, public intoxication, and a reputation for stirring up trouble. But this was different. This was unforgivable. John stepped back into the hall and radioed for backup. "I've got 2 minors in immediate danger and a suspect on site. Send Child Protective Services and EMTs. We'll need a full report on the living conditions." Returning downstairs, he found the boys exactly where he'd left them, their wide eyes glued to him. He crouched again, meeting their level. "It's safe now," he assured them. "No one's gone to hurt you." The braver of the two spoke again, his voice trembling but determined. "Are you going to take us away?" John hesitated. He wanted to promise them the world, to tell them everything would be okay, but he knew the road ahead would be anything but easy. "I'm taking you somewhere safe," he said finally. "You don't have to stay here anymore." As he escorted the boys to his cruiser, the front door swung open violently. Roy staggered out, his face twisted with rage. "Where the hell do you think you're taking them?" he bellowed, clutching a rusted baseball bat. John placed the boys behind him, his hand resting on his firearm. "Step back, Roy," he ordered. "This ends now." Roy sneered, his steps unsteady but aggressive. "You don't get to take them. They're mine. They don't belong to anyone else." "They're not your property," John shot back. "And after what I've seen, you're lucky you're not facing worse charges." Roy lunged, but John was faster. A swift motion disarmed him, and within moments, Roy was face down on the ground, handcuffs securing his wrists. Backup arrived just as John lifted Roy to his feet, shoving him toward another officer. John turned back to the boys, who were now sitting quietly in the cruiser, their faces pale but safe. "He's not coming near you again," John promised them. "Not ever." The boys didn't say anything, but their silence spoke volumes. They had heard promises before, empty words from people who didn't stay. John knew he had to be different. For their sake, he couldn't fail. The small police station hummed with subdued activity as Sheriff John Carter led the two boys inside. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed softly, casting a sterile glow over the room. Michael and Malcolm clung to each other, their faces pale and their eyes darting nervously at every sound. They looked impossibly small against the backdrop of the bustling station, like shadows trying to disappear into the walls. John guided them gently to a quiet corner where he grabbed a couple of blankets from the supply cabinet. He knelt down in front of the boys, his movements slow and deliberate, so as not to startle them. "Here," he said, wrapping the blankets around their shoulders. "This will keep you warm. You're safe now." Michael tightened his grip on Malcolm's hand but didn't respond. Malcolm's small fingers clutched the edge of the blanket as he peeked up at John, his expression a mixture of fear and cautious hope. John motioned for one of the officers to bring over a tray with 2 mugs of hot chocolate and a plate of sandwiches. Setting it on the table in front of them, he pulled up a chair and sat across from the boys. "You can eat," he encouraged softly. "It's yours. No one's going to take it away." The boys hesitated, their wide eyes fixed on the food. Malcolm glanced at Michael as if seeking permission. Michael gave a small nod, and the younger boy reached for a sandwich, his hands trembling slightly. He bit into it tentatively, as though expecting someone to snatch it away at any moment. When no one did, he began eating faster, the sandwich disappearing in a matter of moments. Michael followed suit, but his movements were more measured, and his eyes never leaving John. The sight made John's chest tighten. It wasn't just hunger he saw, it was a deep-seated fear, the kind that came from years of deprivation and neglect. He let them eat in silence, watching as they slowly began to relax, their shoulders losing some of their tension. Once the food was gone, Michael finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are we going to have to go back?" John shook his head firmly. "No, you're not going back there. Not ever." Michael stared at him, his expression unreadable. People always say that. But then they leave, and he comes back. John leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He met Michael's gaze head-on, his voice steady. I'm not leaving. And Roy, he's not coming near you again. I promise you that. The words hung in the air, heavy with sincerity. For a moment, Michael seemed to consider them, his eyes narrowing slightly as though trying to gauge whether John was telling the truth. Finally, he gave a small nod, though the doubt lingered in his expression. Malcolm, however, was more open in his relief. Thank you, he whispered, clutching his blanket tighter around his thin frame. John smiled gently. You don't have to thank me. This is what I'm here for. As the boys settled, John excused himself to step into his office. Inside, he found Officer Kelly waiting with a stack of papers and a sympathetic expression. We've got Roy booked for child abuse, neglect, and resisting arrest, she informed him, handing over the documents. He's not getting out anytime soon. CPS has been contacted and they'll be sending someone to evaluate the situation. John nodded, flipping through the papers. Good. I want every charge to stick. Those boys deserve justice. Kelly hesitated before speaking again. John, CPS might recommend placing them in foster care. It's standard protocol. John's grip on the papers tightened. They've been through enough. I'm not letting them get lost in the system. Kelly raised an eyebrow. You thinking of taking them in yourself? The question lingered in the air. John looked out the window where he could see Michael and Malcolm sitting quietly. Michael was talking to Malcolm, his hand resting protectively on his brother's shoulder. It was clear how much they relied on each other, how much they needed stability. Yes, John said finally. If it comes to that, I'll take them in. Kelly's expression softened. You're a good man, John, but this won't be easy. You know that, right? I know, he replied, his voice resolute, but it's the right thing to do. When he returned to the boys, he found them sitting in silence, their heads resting against each other. They looked so small, so fragile, and John felt a surge of protectiveness rise within him. I've been talking with some people who are going to help us figure out the next steps, he explained as he sat back down. But for now, you're going to stay with me. Is that okay? Michael's eyes widened slightly, suspicion flickering across his face. Why would you do that? John took a deep breath. Because I know what it's like to feel like the world's against you. And because no child should have to go through what you've been through, I want to make sure you're safe. Michael didn't respond immediately. He looked down at his hands, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of the blanket. Malcolm, however, nodded quickly, his face lighting up with a faint smile. Can we stay together? Malcolm asked, his voice small but hopeful. Of course, John assured him. I wouldn't separate you. You're a team, right? Michael glanced at Malcolm, his lips pressing into a thin line. After a moment, he gave a reluctant nod. Okay, he said quietly. John smiled. Good. Now, let's get you both somewhere warm where you can rest. As they left the station, the night air felt lighter somehow, the oppressive weight of fear beginning to lift. For the first time in a long time, Michael and Malcolm felt a glimmer of hope. They didn't know what the future held, but with John by their side, it didn't seem quite as frightening. The drive to John Carter's house was silent but filled with unspoken tension. Michael and Malcolm sat in the back seat, their small bodies huddled together under the weight of uncertainty. The street lights flickered past in steady intervals, casting brief flashes of light over their tired faces. Malcolm clutched the blanket John had given him, his small fingers gripping it tightly. Michael sat rigidly, his eyes locked on the window, as if watching for a danger that could appear at any moment. John glanced at them through the rearview mirror, his heart tightening at their guarded expressions. He wanted to say something, to offer reassurance, but he knew words wouldn't erase years of pain overnight. Instead, he focused on driving, each turn bringing them closer to a new beginning. When they arrived, John parked the car in the driveway of his modest home. The house was small but inviting, its porch light glowing warmly in the cool night air. The lawn was neat, a pair of bicycles leaned against the side of the house, and flower boxes hung under the windows, their blooms vibrant even in the moonlight. John turned off the engine and looked back at the boys. "We're here," he said softly. "Let's get you inside." Michael hesitated, his gaze flicking between John and the house. "This is your place?" he asked, suspicion lacing his voice. John nodded. "Yeah, it's not fancy, but it's home. And for now, it's your home too." Malcolm's eyes lit up slightly at the word home. He tugged on Michael's sleeve, a silent plea to trust John, but Michael remained wary. Still, he climbed out of the car, keeping his body angled protectively toward Malcolm. John led them inside, flipping on the lights as they entered. The living room was cozy, with a large couch, a worn recliner, and shelves lined with books and family photos. A faint smell of lavender lingered in the air, a testament to John's wife's fondness for scented candles. Malcolm's eyes widened as he took in the room. "It's nice," he murmured, his voice filled with awe. Michael remained silent, his eyes darting around the space as if searching for hidden dangers. John noticed the tension in the boys' posture and decided to give them time to adjust. "Why don't you sit down?" John suggested, gesturing to the couch. "I'll get you something to eat." Malcolm moved toward the couch eagerly, but Michael stayed rooted in place, watching John's every move. John didn't push. He simply headed to the kitchen, leaving the boys to settle in. In the kitchen, John prepared a simple meal, sandwiches and apple slices. He knew they probably needed something more substantial, but he didn't want to overwhelm them on their first night. As he worked, he couldn't help but think about his own children, who were currently staying with their grandmother for the week. The house felt quieter without them, but it also made space for Michael and Malcolm to breathe. When he returned to the living room, Malcolm was sitting cross-legged on the couch, his blanket draped over his shoulders like a cape. Michael stood near the window, peering through the curtains. John placed the tray of food on the coffee table and sat down in the recliner, giving the boys space. "You don't have to eat if you're not hungry," he said casually, leaning back in the chair. "But it's here if you want it." Malcolm didn't need convincing. He reached for a sandwich and bit into it, his face lighting up with delight. Michael hesitated, his gaze lingering on the tray before he reluctantly sat down next to his brother and grabbed a sandwich. As they ate, John kept the atmosphere light, asking simple questions. "So, do you guys like movies, books, games?" Malcolm perked up. "I like cartoons," he said shyly, "and I like drawing, too." "That's great," John said with a smile. "We'll have to find some paper and crayons for you." Michael stayed quiet, his guard still firmly in place. But when Malcolm nudged him, he finally muttered, "I like basketball." "Basketball, huh?" John said. "I've got a hoop out back. Maybe we can shoot some hoops tomorrow." Michael gave a small shrug, but John noticed the faintest flicker of interest in his eyes. After they finished eating, John showed the boys to the spare bedroom he had prepared. The room was simple but clean, with twin beds dressed in fresh sheets, a small dresser, and a lamp that cast a warm glow. A stack of extra blankets sat at the foot of each bed. "You can sleep here tonight," John said. "If you need anything, my room is just down the hall." Malcolm climbed onto one of the beds, testing its softness. "It's so nice," he whispered, pulling the blanket up to his chin. Michael stood near the doorway, his arms crossed. "Why are you doing this?" he asked abruptly, his voice laced with suspicion. John met Michael's gaze, his expression serious. "Because no one should have to go through what you've been through, and because you deserve to feel safe." Michael frowned, his defenses still firmly in place. What if he comes back? What if he finds us? "He won't," John said firmly. "Roy is in jail, and he's not getting out any time soon. I've made sure of that." Michael studied him for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether he was telling the truth. Finally, he gave a small nod and walked over to the other bed. He didn't lie down right away, but he sat on the edge, his posture slightly more relaxed. John lingered in the doorway. "Good night, boys. I'll see you in the morning." "Good night," Malcolm replied softly, his eyes already drooping with exhaustion. Michael didn't respond, but as John turned to leave, he caught the boy glancing at him, a flicker of something, gratitude maybe, in his eyes. Back in the living room, John sank onto the couch, rubbing his temples. The weight of the day pressed heavily on his shoulders, but there was also a sense of quiet satisfaction. The boys were safe for now, and that was all that mattered. As he sat there, listening to the house settle into the stillness of the night, John silently vowed to himself that he wouldn't let them down. Whatever it took, he would make sure Michael and Malcolm never had to feel unsafe again. Don't forget to subscribe to stay updated with more stories like this. Share this video with someone who would love to watch it, and explore our channel for more inspiring and heartwarming stories. See you in the next one.